Hello everyone, welcome back. We are starting with Unit 4 of our syllabus on regional trade agreement, and this Unit 4 is on comparative regionalism. In this video, this is basically an introductory video on comparative regionalism, in which I will explain you what we would be doing in our Unit number 4, along with explaining you certain nuances of comparative regionalism in particular and comparative studies in general. Now, if we talk about comparative regionalism is basically a branch of comparative law, which in turn is a branch of comparative studies. So, comparative studies is discipline, and the specialized branch of comparative studies is comparative law, and a super specialized branch of comparative law is comparative regionalism. So, we are talking about very specific and super specialized branch of comparative study. Although it is a part of the same comparative studies, and all the principles which we read in comparative studies are also equally applicable in case where we talk about comparative law and comparative regionalism. Now, comparative regionalism as a super specialized branch is of very recent origin, and it has started in 1970s and 1980s. When there has been a sudden mushrooming of regional integration organization across the globe. So in 1970s and 80s, around the globe, there was a sudden rise of regional integration organization, particularly in Asian countries, African countries, and North American countries. Regional organization and entering into an RTA becomes very fashionable. One of the prominent reasons why they start choosing RTA was the failure of MTN rounds, multilateral trade negotiation round, particularly the Uruguay round, which took 8 years to complete. Now, with this long delay, the community of nations, particularly the developing nations, start losing trust into multilateral trade negotiation, and they decide that we will go on our own custom-made trade negotiation, in which we will try to liberalize and we will try to integrate our economies on a smaller scale, which could be replicated subsequently globally, which is also a part of what we were discussing earlier, the piecemeal approach to multilateralism, a step-by-step approach to multilateralism. And the reason why comparative regionalism started in 1970s and 80s was a quest for finding mantra for success. So what makes a regional organization a successful regional organization was always a question, and this question led people to do the comparative study to find out which system is better and what is the thing which we should adopt to make our own regional integration organization a successful regional integration organization. So this is these are the two prominent reasons how the comparative regionalism as a super specialized branch started to grow. Now, there's one statement which is important to read about, which tells about why the comparison is necessary. And this statement is by Marcus Aurelius, a Roman philosopher, in his book Meditation. What he wrote is he says, and I quote, "How much he gains who does not look to see what his neighbor says, does, or thinks, but only at what he does himself to make it just and holy." But what Marcus is basically trying to point out here is that for the development of a society and the development of a legal system, or any kind of a system, if you talk about, you are supposed to look outside also. And why this looking outside is necessary? Because this is necessary for two reasons. One is that we can adopt their best practices, we can learn from there, and we can adopt their good things. Second, we can avoid mistakes made by them. So these are the two reasons why you are supposed to look to your neighbors including the neighboring country or neighboring regional organization. So the two reasons is that we can learn from their best practices, and we can also avoid making the same mistake which they have made. And again, this is also the part of why we read history. So the whole debate about why we read history, the reason behind reading history is not just to learn dates in the history, but to learn from the mistake which others have made, and secondly, to adopt their best practices. And that's the reason we learn We learn history, why we read about world wars, why we read about other things, colonialism, why we read about British occupation of India. These are the reason why we read, is to learn from their best practices and to avoid making mistake. If there's any best practices we can adopt, and we can avoid making the same mistake which they have made. Now, coming to the definition of comparative regionalism, there are a few definitions which we can note down. The first is the general definition, which says the comparative law is a systematic study of particular legal system, tradition, and legal rules in comparison to a foreign legal system. So, how the comparison is done? A particular legal system in comparison to a foreign legal system and tradition. And what is the ultimate goal? As I told you, to find better laws and regulations. The comparative study is not done for the sake of doing a comparison. The whole purpose is to find better laws and regulations, as I told you, to learn from their mistakes and to adopt their best practices if there is any. So better laws and regulations is one of the prominent reasons why we do comparative study. There is another definition given by Samuel Stendhal, who says comparative study is a cross-societal and cross-institutional study of a phenomena. So very, very plain and simple, it's a cross definition, is a cross-societal and cross-institutional. So you bring in two institutions, try to make analysis amongst them and find out which one is better. And again the purpose is the same, to find better laws and regulations. The last definition is the comparative law is an intellectual activity with the law as its object and comparison as the process. The one thing you have to keep in mind, when you take comparative study, the comparison is just a process. And what is the object? The law is an object. So we don't have to miss out on the methodology. But what we are not doing comparison for the sake of comparison, but we are doing comparison for the purpose of finding out the laws. And what law we are talking about? We are talking about better law and regulation. Not just any law, but a better law and regulation. This is what we are talking about. Now, in comparative analysis, there are certain methodology which we have to keep in mind, and these methodology determine our approach to our comparative studies. There are three sets of, as you can see in this slide, there are three sets of methodology which we will discuss. The first is micro comparative analysis and macro comparative analysis. Now, this micro comparative analysis and macro comparative analysis is just like microeconomics and macroeconomics, which you have already done. Now, in micro comparative analysis, we talk about particular area, particular specific issues. For example, a particular factor of production analysis made upon for a particular factor of production, rather than having a general discussion. For example, the approach in RRT, as I am teaching to you, we are discussing in class, is a micro comparative analysis in which we are basically talking about trade integration rather than other political or social integration. Although time and again we have discussion about political and political and social integration, but our focus is mainly on trade integration. Now, when we talk about micro comparative analysis, is much more exhaustive, and it includes everything, not just trade. It includes politics, it includes economics, it includes society, it includes cultural aspect, and includes many more things. So macroeconomics analysis is much more exhaustive than micro, but our approach in the present subject, because of the paucity of time, etc., is the micro. We have taken a particular we have taken a specific, not a bird eye view, but a specific issue of a microeconomic level. Now, the second set of methodology is endogenous and exogenous analysis. Now, what is endogenous? Endogenous is basically those factors which are inside, the domestic factor which determine the success or the failure of a regional trade organization. For example, success of SAARC is not just dependent upon international relation between the member nations, but also their domestic policies, their GDP, their factor of productions, their economic development, their technological development, and many other things. So this is called as endogenous factors or endogenous analysis, where we talk inside that regional integration of India is not only dependent upon the relationship. For example, if we talk about India and Pakistan, so it is not just India and Pakistan international relation, but also the internal politics and internal societal ideation which happens in these countries, which also determine the level of integration between them. The second is exogenous analysis. Now, in exogenous analysis, we look outside. So, the development of SOC or success or failure of a SOC is not only dependent upon the internal factors like GDP, the economic development, the technological development, and other factors, the domestic politics, but also on exogenous factors or the factors which are outside the region. For example, the trade of, for example, India or any other member nation is having much more better relationship with the other countries. For example, the biggest trading partner of India has been China. So these are the external factors because China can offer us more than what our neighboring nations can offer. So these are the exogenous factors which is beyond us, which is beyond the domain which we are talking about, the external factors. We can simply define exogenous, endogenous analysis and exogenous analysis, study of inside the domestic inner region. Exogenous is outside the external region which can determine the success and failure of regional trade organization. Now the last set of approach or the methodology is realism, rationalism, and internationalism. Now realism, rationalism, and internationalism are basically the part of international relations studies. But it has significance in our discussion also, particularly it determines how you will approach your comparative studies analysis. Now realism and internationalism are the two extreme and the rationalism is the middle path. Now what realism and rationalism, internationalism, basically how they are differentiated on the basis of how much importance they give to the role of the state. So you'll find realism gives too much importance to the role of the government or the state. So it says international relations and your regional organization is primarily dependent upon how your state is going to behave or how your government is going to behave. Like the way we were discussing about intergovernmentalism and illiberal intergovernmentalism. So realism is basically about intergovernmentalism. So what realism says, that the states are the central actor which determines the dynamics of world politics and international relations. So this is realist approach. So without the state, you cannot move ahead. So if your government is not agreeing to collaborate on the regional trade forum, nothing can possibly be done. And non-state actors, including civil society, corporates, individual, etc., they have no or very limited scope when it comes to international negotiation. And it is primarily central actors are the state. When we talk about a state, it's the state and the instrumentality of the state, the government which we are talking about. Now, internationalism is the other extreme. And the internationalism basically aims at creation of a wide globe, which we were discussing in class, and it transcends nationalism and it creates greater cooperation amongst the community of a nation. It also aims at creating a global government. So this is basically about internationalism. It gained currency with the emergence of organizations like United Nations, WTO, WHO, etc. The internationalism gained currency, and it is also very popular. Although sometimes it looks like a utopia, but for many believe that this is the way to go. Maybe 20 years from now, 30, 50 years from now, we will move to internationalism. But as of now, it looks very hard to achieve, and that's the reason we come to a discussion about rationalism. The utopian nature, the lofty idealism of internationalism let many to go into the idea of rationalism, which is basically a middle ground between realism and internationalism. It says international organization, international structure, international cooperation are important, but states are also indispensable. And the state will lead, but non-state actors, civil society, the corporates, the individual, they have a role to play and they have a significant role to play, but the lead would be taken by the states or the national government which we are talking about. And this is what we will presently see today also. Although everybody has a role to play, everybody has a role to contribute, but it's basically the state which determines, the government which determines how you will, for example, how the India will behave with its neighbor, would basically be determined by our national government and the state, although other factors are important and they play a role, but it's basically about the national government. So these are the three approaches through which you can do a comparative study, and these approach will determine what would be your result. Now, what we will be doing in Unit 4, the scope which we are talking about, we will do comparative regionalism, and we have picked up two organizations to compare with SOC. The first is ASEAN and the European Union. Why I have picked up European Union? The fact that it is one of the most successful regional organization of the present time, and although it is having their own problem with British exit, etc., EU nonetheless is comparatively the most successful regional trade organization. Common currency, common visa, open borders, European Parliament, etc., etc. You will find this is the reason why European. Why I've chosen, the second is Asian. Why I've chosen Asian? Because Asian is having a kind of similar socio-economic and political background as a South Asian nation. So they have the same kind of, they're also, most of them are developing and underdeveloped nations, and they have the same social structure. They're similar, not identical, but similar political and social and cultural and economic structure as us. And that's the reason why I've chosen Asian and EU. And how we would make comparison? We'll make comparison on the basis of these three criteria. One is on the basis of ideation and integration, how ideation plays a role. Then about governance model in these three regional integration organizations, and then the institution and structures of these three international regional trade organizations. I think this is it about our first introductory video. In the portal, in the Genome Learning portal, I have attached a reading for you, an article which is the problem of comparison and comparative regionalism, written by Philip de Lombardi and others. So you are required to read this article, and then we will go ahead and discuss other parts of our unit. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.